Hello and welcome back to Round the Table, slow TV radio from the meeting point, broadcasting not only to Bilbao but throughout the world. Hello and welcome to Round the Table, episode 70. In this week's programme we are discussing the topic of history. And coming up we have some very interesting facts about history. We have this week's typical mistakes. We have some interesting phrases that came up in conversation. We have the quote of the week. We have the origin of another phrase that is often used. We also have pronunciation problems and of course the monologue from our mystery guest speaker. Though this week we have a double bill of monologues. We have two of them this week. So first of all, if you are a new listener to this podcast, don't forget to press the subscribe button. All you have to do is click the button. You have to do nothing else. You don't have to pay. It's absolutely free. There was some confusion. People thought you had to pay for this, but no, you don't. Just click the subscribe button because we like it if you do that. So, let's begin the program. Where shall we begin? Let's have some phrases that came up this week. To sweep something under the carpet is to hide something or pretend that it's not there, pretend that it doesn't exist. So in this week's conversation we were talking about aspects of our country's history that we don't like to think about. Maybe certain atrocities might have been committed in the past. So we hide them away and pretend that we've forgotten about them. So they are swept under the carpet. In the same way as some people like to sweep phrasal verbs under the carpet or pronunciation. They pretend that these things don't exist, but they are very important. The next one is to whitewash over. Whitewash is like white paint for painting the walls of your room. So maybe the walls are not in good condition or they're a bit dirty, but you whitewash over them to pretend that they are very clean and nice. So sometimes we can whitewash over parts of our history, again, to pretend that the dirty parts, the ugly parts are not there. We make them look nice and clean and fresh. So to whitewash over the past. And the third one was to open old wounds. You could say there's no use opening old wounds, or it's better not to open old wounds. So that's when we're talking about things that are uncomfortable to think about, things that are very emotive to talk about. So in this case we were talking about recent Spanish history, and sometimes it's difficult to teach things about civil war because it's still a very fresh memory for the people, and maybe in 100 years into the future it will be easier to talk about it, but at the moment it's still quite recent, so people maybe are a bit sensitive about talking about these things. So that is to open old wounds. A wound, of course, is like an injury, but of course we don't have to do a what's the difference. An injury is more accidental and a wound is more deliberate. So you are wounded with a knife or a gun. Usually somebody does it to you. Okay, let's have a look at the quote of the week. And this week's quote of the week is by Abba Eban, who apparently was an Israeli politician. And he says, "History teaches us that men and nations behave wisely once they have exhausted all other alternatives." What he means is that if we look back at history, the correct decision is finally made when all other options have already been tried, and usually the the final option was actually the correct one. And while I was researching Abba Eban, I found another quote by the same person. He was describing somebody, I'm not sure who he was talking about, but he said, "His ignorance is encyclopedic," which I thought was a very funny quotation. His ignorance is encyclopedic. You may have heard the phrase, "they get on like a house on fire," meaning they have a very good relationship. And many people have commented on this very strange phrase because a house on fire would not really be a very positive thing, would it? And I've often thought that it's very strange. And recently I found a quote and I can't find it. I thought it was in Oscar Wilde, but I've had a conversation with my chat GPT and my computer can't find the quotation, but it found another quotation. So I've got this one here from Phineas Finn, Anthony Trollope from 1869, and this is part of the dialogue in this book. "How are you getting on with your canvass?" This canvass is a political campaign. "Oh," he says, "like a house on fire," said Phineas cheerily. So this means making good progress. So what has happened? If you go back and look at the older versions of getting on, there is another phrasal verb, to get on, which means to make good progress. And it seems, because there are two get on phrasal verbs, the metaphor of making good progress, to get on like a house on fire, I think the one that I found somewhere was to do with studying, and it was like, how are you getting on with reading all those books? And someone said, "Oh, I'm getting on like a house on fire." You can see how that fire would spread, and so the studying, making progress, you can see where the analogy comes from with that getting on. And then there's the other phrasal verb, to get on with somebody, as in have a good relationship, and it seems the metaphor has just transferred to the other use of the phrasal verb, and that's why it doesn't seem to make any sense. But I thought that would be interesting for you. Anyway, let's have a little bit of pronunciation next. The letter Z. Okay, the letter Z, if you speak Spanish, you probably go th. If you're from Castilian Spanish, at least, maybe not if you're South American. But here in Spain, the Z is pronounced like a th. It's never pronounced like that in English, okay? It's going to be a z. So here are some words. The first one came up in conversation this week, Gaza. Gaza, we're talking about the dispute in Palestine at the moment. That place, that area is called Gaza with a z in it. There's another city called Zurich. We pronounce it Zurich. And we also have words like zombie. Ooh, Halloween this weekend. Zombie, not zombie, but zombie. And we have Zoom meetings online. Not Zoom, but Zoom. There are some other words with Zs, and they tend to be very German-based words. So a word like Nazi, as in the German Socialist Party, is pronounced Nazi. It's pronounced more like a TS sound, Nazi. And also the composer Mozart takes the same pronunciation. So sometimes with German words we do that ts sound. But otherwise it's going to be a z, but never th. And for this week's monologue with our celebrity guest speaker, this week we have two celebrity guest speakers. The first one is going to be talking about the benefits of learning history and why it is important. Whereas the second speaker will be trying to persuade you that history is really a waste of time. So, Let's listen to these monologues.
History is far more than a record of dates and battles. It is the memory of humanity. Without it, we lose our sense of identity and direction. Understanding where we come from helps us see how societies change, how ideas evolve, and how progress is even possible. The past offers lessons that remain essential today. Every generation faces challenges, war, inequality, injustice, and history shows what has worked and what has failed. Ignoring these lessons only increases the risk of repeating the same mistakes under new names or different leaders. History also connects us to people who might otherwise be forgotten. By studying not only kings and wars, but also ordinary lives, we develop empathy and perspective. It reminds us that human experience is shared and that the problems of today often have deep historical roots. A society that forgets its past is easily manipulated. History helps us recognise propaganda, question authority, and defend truth. It teaches us to think critically, not blindly follow. Remembering our history does not trap us in it. It allows us to build a wiser, more balanced future.
Many people claim that history is essential because it teaches us who we are. But in reality, most of what we learn is simplified, selective, and often biased. School history focuses on monarchs and wars, not on the lives of ordinary people. It shapes identity, but not necessarily truth. Some argue that studying history helps us avoid repeating mistakes, yet the same conflicts, prejudices, and power struggles continue. If history truly taught us lessons, the world would be wiser and more peaceful by now. Instead, we use the past to justify new divisions and old hatreds. In many countries, history functions as propaganda. It glorifies the nation, highlights victories, and ignores shameful chapters. Young people are taught to feel pride rather than curiosity, loyalty rather than understanding. This emotional version of the past limits thought instead of encouraging it. Perhaps it is time to look forward. The challenges we face, climate change, technology, inequality, cannot be solved by looking backward. The past can inspire reflection, but obsession with it prevents progress. We should focus less on honoring old stories and more on creating a fairer, more intelligent future.
Two very different but very interesting opinions. Which one did you find most persuasive? Is history important, or is it a waste of time? Leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. And of course you can leave a comment about anything else. Anything that you would like to hear in the podcast, or any questions that you would like answered. Leave them in the comments down below. And don't forget that subscribe button. Next we have a couple of little mistakes. They're not really typical mistakes, but they're interesting mistakes that came up when talking about religions. first one is Christianity. If you look at most religions, we can put an ism on the end. We have Catholicism, Protestantism, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism. They're all isms. But Christianity, I don't know why it's called Christianity, but it's not Christianism. We call it Christianity. The next one is Jews. This is more of a pronunciation problem. If you want the plural of Jew, you put a z on the end. Okay, it has to be the Z sound. Z. If you put a s on the end, you say juice, like orange juice, pineapple juice. Okay, that's something you drink with your breakfast. So Jews with a z on the end. Make sure you get the pronunciation right. Another religion is the Muslim people. Muslim. We don't say Mussulman, even though it does exist in some old writing. If I hear the word Mussulman, I think of this kind of muscle man. Okay, so try to correct that one. Now, let's have some facts. They're not amazing, but they are quite interesting. So I've been looking at the history of the planet and the length of time that this planet has been here and the amount of time that we have been here. Now, I've been looking in this book by Bill Bryson, A Short History of Nearly Everything, and he's got some very interesting analogies. He says, if you take the history of the planet 4,500 million years, and you condense it down into one day. Okay, so using the length of time the planet has been here and pretending it's 24 hours. So the first single-celled organisms started at about 4 a.m. So the first 4 hours of the day, there's nothing there. Then we have single-celled organisms, very, very basic things. Then nothing changes for the next 16 hours. So not until 8:30 in the evening do we have the first sea plants, followed 20 minutes later by jellyfish. So they arrive round about shortly before 9 o'clock in the evening, we get jellyfish. Then at 10 o'clock in the evening, we have the first plants on land, which are followed by the first land animals. We have the huge Carboniferous rainforests, and dinosaurs appear at 11 o'clock in the evening. Okay, they last about 40 minutes, and about 20 to midnight they disappear, and the age of mammals begins. And then at about 1 minute before midnight, we appear. Another way he describes the same idea is to say, if you stretch your arms out to their fullest extent, imagine the width of your arm span is the equivalent of the entire history of the Earth. On this scale, the distance from the fingertips of one hand to the wrist of the other is called the Precambrian era, in which we have very basic life forms. All complex life is in one hand, and with a single stroke of a nail file, you could eradicate the complete human history. That's an interesting analogy, isn't it? On Thursday, we were talking about dinosaurs, and if you want an interesting fact about dinosaurs, the Stegosaurus never met the Tyrannosaurus. If you go back in time, the Tyrannosaurus lived 66 million years ago. The Stegosaurus lived 83 million years before that. So, technically, the Tyrannosaurus is closer to the mobile phone in time than it is to the Stegosaurus, which is pretty amazing, I think you'll agree. A similar one is talking ancient Egyptians and Cleopatra. Cleopatra the seventh, the famous one, was the Queen of Egypt. Was she a queen? A pharaoh? Whatever a female pharaoh is called, I'm not sure. Anyway, she was running Egypt 2,000 years ago. The pyramids are 4,500 years old. 2,500 years before Cleopatra. So again, Cleopatra is closer to the mobile phone than the construction of the pyramids. That's amazing. Here's something quite interesting that I was telling the class about this week. We were talking about the lack of information about the normal people in history. We tend to learn all about kings and battles and the great people of the past. And we have very little evidence concerning normal people. These things here are called the Vindolanda tablets. Vindolanda is a Roman camp, not really a fort, maybe it was a fort in its day. It's in the north of England, up near Hadrian's Wall. Vindolanda, it's called, and it was occupied from about 85 AD, and they used these thin pieces of wood, little wooden leaflets which are sort of like the size of a postcard, and they used to use them for sending messages. Anyway, they found thousands of these things that were buried in the ground, and because the ground is very wet and there's no oxygen, these things survived, whereas normally they would have disappeared. But they found these things and they can analyse the writing, they can read these messages. Many of them are official military reports, but there are also a lot of private letters between soldiers and their families and local civilians. There is also an invitation to a birthday party, which is the earliest known writing by a woman in Latin. It's an invitation to a birthday party. That's interesting. And there are also complaints about the cold weather, requests for more socks, and more complaints about the poor quality of the beer. Those Romans coming over and complaining about our beer. And that's all we have time for this week. I hope it's all been very interesting and educational for you. Don't forget to click on the subscribe button because we like that kind of thing, and leave some comments down below if you would like to ask any questions or give me a suggestion on things that we could do in the podcast in the future. Next week we're discussing scams, fakes and cheats, and I look forward to seeing you all during the week. And if I don't see you during the week, have a good week. Till next week.